Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak on the Telstra Corporation and Other Legislation Amendment Bill 2021. Mr Deputy Speaker, Telstra has a long history of service within Australia, and as we change as a business, or as Telstra changes as a business, enacting a corporate restructuring means legislation must keep up. Telstra has many obligations to the Australian people, particularly in regard to having restrictions on foreign ownership, the universal service obligation, emergency call services and priority assistance, as well as the requirement for Telstra to allow other carriers to access their transmission towers. Mr Deputy Speaker, this bill stands to ensure that while Telstra restructures its business, it continues to be controlled under regulatory equivalence, unable to utilise any legal loopholes that may appear due to the reformation, and continuing to serve the interest of Australian people in its role as the country's largest telecommunications carrier. Mr Deputy Speaker, this bill stands to ensure that Telstra's operations as a private business will not be to the detriment of the Australian consumer and the services we require. This bill has its technical complexities, but at the end of the day, it is here to serve us all and support Telstra's transition and restructuring. This bill will uphold Telstra's current obligations to Australian communities, Australian businesses, and indeed Australia's broader community by maintaining regulatory equivalence for Telstra's successor entities. Mr Deputy Speaker, I wish not to reduce this bill to its intricacies, but instead to focus on what it stands for. Simply put, this bill stands for protecting consumers, promoting competition, and also allowing regional Australia to flourish. Whether it's bushfires, floods, or COVID, we know how essential, reliable, and accessible telecommunications are to the safety and security of all Australians. The explosion of telecommunications services worldwide has provided opportunities for economic development never thought of before in human history. Services like telehealth, Netflix, services that help people through bushfires and in emergencies like floods. Consumers want to be able to know that their telecommunication access is both stable and certain. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, since Telstra finalised its privatisation in 2011, it's been required to uphold certain obligations limiting foreign ownership of the company. Telstra's critical role within the telecommunications market means that we want their ownership and headquarters to remain largely on Australian soil. And this bill speaks to that by maintaining and ensuring Telstra's restructuring does not affect its ownership and subsequently its service to the Australian people. This bill ensures Telstra will remain a maximum of 35% foreign owned, with no more than 5% owned by an individual foreign investor. Moreover, the headquarters must be on domestic soil, allowing proper government oversight mechanisms to protect Australian consumers. Mr Deputy Speaker, this policy reaffirms the government's enhancement of the Foreign Investment Review Board regime, ensuring critical national assets, including that of telecommunications, are protected. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, Telstra currently is under the obligation to provide many services core to Australia and its people. For instance, the universal service obligation guarantees the delivery of payphone services in rural and remote areas, as well as the operation of crucial emergency services line like 000. And as anyone who's lived in the bush knows, it's important to have these services on hand. They're key and they cannot falter whilst Telstra restructures. Hence, this bill simply serves to ensure that they will continue to operate effectively under Telstra's renamed entity ServCo, which will handle service delivery. This bill is just one step toward the commitment of the Morrison government to ensure all Australians have access to reliable, essential telecom services. In fact, the government has been informed by Telstra that they are already drafting agreements ensuring the smooth continuity of these services after the restructuring. In light of this, the provisions within this bill provide an important safety net of service for the Australian consumer. It's comforting to know that despite the telecommunications industry having changed so much over the past decades, Telstra's role has remained crucial and steadfast as the sector and country changes around us. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Tower Access Framework is rooted in the motivation to increase competition within the telecommunications sector in Australia. The framework seeks to ensure businesses are running efficiently and those savings are passed on to consumers. This is achieved by providing other carriers with access to the tower infrastructure. This framework does not stop at Telstra as a carrier. Indeed, Mr. Deputy Speaker, all carriers will be regulated under this bill. Telstra's restructure, Mr. Deputy Speaker, has revealed indeed a loophole within the current tower access framework in that a carrier could potentially shift its tower assets to a non-carrier subsidiary that it controls to avoid its obligation to provide access to tower assets. This bill will close this loophole and ensure Australian consumers are protected, whichever carrier they use. This bill addresses this information by rigorously defining the meaning of owned and operated so that there are clear requirements in terms of share ownership and executive power. Mr. Deputy Speaker, this bill designates power to the Minister to direct an individual Telstra subsidiary to take on the obligations of another subsidiary, if it's the case that the initial subsidiary has failed, is failing or is likely to fail to fulfil an obligation. Moreover, if Telstra is failing to comply with the given direction, they may be liable for penalty. This acts as a safeguard to ensure that any potential restructuring of Telstra will always result in their obligations to Australia, to Australian consumers, are being satisfied irrespective of the formation of the parent and subsidiary businesses. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the government has made significant steps in improving telecommunications across Australia, particularly in our regional and rural areas. Nearly $300 million has been committed to the Mobile Black Spot program, which ensures that regional and remote Australia has access to the same high-quality mobile coverage available in urban areas. And I will also note that with our Modern Manufacturing Fund and investment in space as one of our priority Modern Manufacturing Fund initiatives, that space will continue to be a very important aspect of our strategic direction with regards to things like mobile black spots. And that is because Australia is leading the way with regards to GPS. And that GPS work that is being done under the space modern manufacturing will enable black spots to become a thing of the past. And I'd encourage anyone who's interested in this area to look at the Space Committee inquiry under the Science Committee, of which I was a member, to look at some of the wonderful initiatives that are being led and enabled by government and led by industry. Nearly $300 million has been given to the Mobile Black Spot program, and over $200 million is going toward the Regional Connectivity Program, which is developing stronger infrastructure across these same areas. And, of course, an extra $4.5 billion towards the NBN network, with particular focus on ensuring the infrastructure is strong in regional areas. Of course, Mr. Deputy Speaker, there is more to do, and the Morrison government is committed to work towards this, having enlisted the Regional Telecommunications Independent Review Committee to examine further potential reforms in the sector. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the bill before us today is recognition that as the governance of our critical telecommunications carrier sector changes in line, it must change in line with business changes. Telstra has played and continues to play a critical role in Australia's history, since its inception and now into the future, to guarantee the continuation of its key role in the delivery of things like emergency services and countrywide access to telecommunications. We should all make sure we support this bill and that we can all be proud that this is delivering for Australians here. With Telstra upholding the universal service obligation, this bill ensures that payphone services will continue to be available in even the most remote areas of Australia, a crucial policy in maintaining our connection as a country. We're needing this now more than ever, as together we face some pretty interesting times. I commend this bill to the House. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker.